Hello and welcome. I'm Ali Mustafa and you're watching Straight Talk. US President Donald Trump has reimposed sanctions on Iran and has issued a stern warning to any country that violates the ban. In a tweet, Trump said the sanctions would hurt Iran and that more were expected later this year. Under the sanctions, Iran will be unable to trade in US dollars and its energy and automotive sectors will be targeted. Despite this, Trump offered to talk to Iran, but Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has rejected Trump's offer.
What's the meaning of negotiations when you impose sanctions at the same time? It's like someone pulling a knife to stab a rival or an enemy in the arm, while at the same time claiming we should be talking and negotiating.
In May, the United States withdrew from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal negotiated under the previous Obama administration. The European Union, which co-signed the deal, says it wants to preserve the agreement and maintain economic ties with Iran.
We are doing our best to keep Iran in the deal, to keep Iran benefiting from the economic benefits that the agreement brings to the people of Iran, because we believe that this is the security interests of not only our region, but also of the world.
Turkey has also said it has no plans to follow the US sanctions and will continue to trade with Iran. And joining me now to discuss this further is David Patrick Karakos, who is the author of Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State, and Borzu Daragahi. He is a senior non-resident fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank, the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for both of you for being here. Let's begin with you, Borzu. What is the sentiment on the streets of Iran following these sanctions?
I mean, I think it's a little bit tough to tell just because it's hard to get eyes on the ground. But, you know, there seems to be a palpable anger, and that has been going on for months. You know, a lot of it directed at the regime, some of it probably directed at the Trump administration. There's frustration. The rial has collapsed. This is causing a lot of pain for ordinary people, making their daily struggles even harder than they were before.
You've got these protests that have continued for months now, intermittently, but the state has allowed them, hasn't necessarily cracked down hard on the protesters, despite this economic situation, relations with the US. Why is that, David?
Look, I mean, the Islamic Republic is in a tricky situation. Was absolutely right in what he says. There's a lot of anger, and I mean, it should be pointed out as well that it is not lost on the Iranian people that while they are struggling, billions have been poured into adventurism across the Middle East. So I speak to people in Iran, and you know, there is a sense of, well, why, when we don't have enough food, well, not quite enough food, but why, when we're struggling so much, are we funding adventures at the other end of the Middle East to, you know, support this sort of regime's adventurism? I mean, we have also, you know, the sort of perennial issue of demographics as well. It's a very young society. I remember studying Persian in Iran and seeing people that had come to study engineering end up studying French literature. I don't think they probably ended up getting jobs. So the regime, it's very tricky for them at the moment. You know, push too far and things could spill over. At a time where they really don't want things to spill over, we have the imposition of sanctions. Things are going to get worse. So if you start cracking down now, I think it's bad news for the regime. One thing they are good at is handling uprisings. They were born of one themselves. And
they handled it in 2009. David alluded to Syria. How important is Syria for the regime?
I think that the Syrian adventure, as well as their interventions in Iraq and Yemen and so on, but Syria especially, are seen by many people inside the regime as existential. They did not want Bashar al-Assad to go. They saw that as an extremely important thing to maintain his power. They spent a lot of money and spilt a lot of blood defending Bashar al-Assad, and now they're kind of stuck. If they pull out at this point without anything much to show for it, no business deals, no real political influence, they lose. But if they keep going in and keep getting more deeply involved in Syria, they're going to be drawing a lot of international as well as domestic attention to this intervention. And, you know, they lose in that sense as well.
But don't these sanctions then, I'll bring David in here as well, flip things around? U.S. intervention doesn't necessarily unify people behind Rouhani. behind the leadership?
Well, I mean, look, I mean, first, you know, you have to say, you said Rouhani and the leadership. I mean, Rouhani is not the leadership. You know, the leader of Iran is the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and people have to understand it. Now, the Syria thing, you're absolutely correct. It was seen as existential by the regime. You know, it's a land bridge to Hezbollah. It's, I mean, if Assad falls, then they were worried Tehran was next. I would differ slightly in the sense that I think that battle is pretty much won now. With the Americans now, with Russia especially, Assad, I think, is not going anywhere. I think Iran has more or less achieved what it wants. But the thing is, you have to, you know, you have to sort of differentiate between what the regime believes to be an existential threat and the fact that people don't have enough jobs and there's hyperinflation and the rial is collapsing.
But then the regime can turn around and say that, oh, it's Rouhani's fault. Does it then necessarily save itself? Borzou.
I mean, they're already saying that it's Rouhani's fault. They're saying, you know, see, we told you so. You made this deal with the Americans. We gave up our nuclear program as kind of low end as it was. And what have we got to show for it? I think those domestic political battles would be going on no matter what. So I'm not sure if that's such a huge issue. You asked a good question. Will the sanctions affect the pocketbook of the regime? I think ultimately no. I think it will hurt ordinary people, but the oil sales will continue. As a matter of fact, it might make the hardline elements of the regime more powerful as there's less private sector business interactions with the rest of the world and more resources devoted proportionally to the state.
I want your answer, but I want you to answer about something else as well.
Sure.
Flipping everything around, the sanctions in Syria and Iran and Turkey on opposite ends on the Syrian conflict. But now Turkey says it'll stand by Iran when it comes to these sanctions. So the pocketbook, as Borzou said, might not be hurt.
No, absolutely. Look, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, which actually, funnily enough, it was Rafsanjani who became a great enemy of them. He was the one that let them into the economy in the 1980s. Look, they are masters at sanctions busting. They are masters at making money from this. But again, you have to differentiate between the regime and elements in the regime and the people. Now, the question is, how much pressure can the people take? How much can they take? Now, Donald Trump was absolutely cretinously stupid to tear up the nuclear deal. I mean, I say tear it up at the American end because people often make the mistake of thinking it's a bilateral deal between Iran and the US. It's not. It's between Iran and the P5+1. But in the final analysis, who did the Iranians care about? The Americans, obviously. Now, you know, this was why when Obama extended his hand to the Islamic Republic, it was a problem for them because the raison d'etre, or a great reason for the emergence of the Islamic Republic, is to defend against the great state. The Shah was the great poodle, the puppet. But the fact is, when your great enemy extends a hand to you, you know, it's a lot harder for you to say that he's an existential threat. Now, what Trump has done by ripping up the nuclear deal, by talking tough against Iran, has to a certain degree made, and, you know, Borzou was absolutely right. There's a constant dialectic going on internally between hardliners and moderates. I use the term loosely, it's all relative. Going on constantly, and he has emboldened the hardliners. And it could be not only politically, saying to Rouhani, you were always wrong to trust the great Satan, because you remember when the deal was made, afterwards Khamenei made a point of saying, this is it. This is not going to be the thin end of the wedge. No more détente. And now many of those around him are saying, look, we were right. So Rouhani is weakened. But at the same time, these sanctions will hurt the people. And that, whatever the regime may make personally, it's going to be a problem.
An olive branch coming from the Europeans. They've said they will continue trading with Iran. How possible or plausible can it be to overcome these U.S. sanctions?
I think it's plausible, but it's tough. I think that, for example, there would be no problem with small and medium-sized businesses. Those trades will continue, the business will continue with the EU as well as with Turkey and other countries. Where it gets into problems is like big companies. Mercedes-Benz already said that they're going to shut down their rather small probatory operations in Iran. You know, these huge companies that have, and we're not just talking about cars, we're talking about very specialized equipment. You know, for example, the equipment needed to make specialized lenses for, you know, various high-end industrial stuff. These companies that do a lot of business globally, these high-end companies can't do business in Iran anymore because they can't afford to lose the U.S. market. They can't afford to be barred from making dollar transactions. But you're going to still have business taking place. It's going to go underground a little bit. It's going to be more small scale. I think that realistically speaking, looking at the history, the Islamic Republic of Iran will survive through these sanctions. It just won't be in a better place afterward.
The people might not. Despite the sanctions, there are some winners, so to speak. We mentioned Syria, we haven't mentioned Russia in all of this. David?
I mean, Russia's played a very clever game in Syria, and it's got pretty much what it wanted. And, this is a country which also has very, very big problems at home. I mean, when Putin came to power, he made a very clear deal, albeit tacit one, with the Russian people, which was, you accept higher standards of living for more autocracy, because obviously Russia is essentially an almost one-resource economy. Oil prices were going through the roof, and that, happened. Then, of course, Russia has now, for having falling energy prices, has a lot of, more internal grumblings, and they have placated their population by adventurism again. Now they have this naval facility, people call it a base, it's not. At Tartus, it's a naval facility. So they do have interest there.
Yeah, but some would say it's also become some sort of a problem solver, the go-to people when it comes to Israel and Iran, for example, in Syria.
At the moment,
It's go-to, but it hasn't solved anything. As a matter of fact, in many respects, the Russian mendacity, telling everyone what they want to hear, has escalated the situation in Syria between Iran and Israel and created a very dangerous situation for everyone.
It also cannot last. Russia, I mean, you're absolutely right. Russia can't keep telling everyone what it wants to hear for any length of time. This is not a sustainable policy.
For Russia?
For everybody.
For the region.
For everybody.
Iran.
Yeah, for the region.
And Turkey is...
For the Americans.
I think Turkey is getting played by Russia as well. I think every single country is getting played by Russia, and Russia plays this mediating role, but it can't deliver anything. It can't let, Camp David, the U.S. Showered money on Egypt, showered money on Israel, got them to do peace, pushed them into a room together. Russia can't do that.
No. Russia is going broke pretty quickly.
It's fascinating. We started the conversation with Iran and we're ending it with
but
Russia.
You can't separate the two now, especially in the Middle East.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Since its founding as a republic, Turkey has had a history of military coups, with a failed one taking place 2 years ago. Now, under new constitutional powers, the Turkish president has introduced reforms to limit the military's role in politics and place it under greater civilian control. But can these reforms succeed given Turkey's history? Can Hasasu looks at the delicate balance between Turkey's military and its civilian leadership.
Just over a year after Turkish voters opted for a new presidential system and a month following his election victory, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has announced his new cabinet. And perhaps one of the most noticeable changes concerns the defense structure. Under the former parliamentary system, the Prime Minister headed the government, with a civilian Minister of Defense and Chief of Staff serving under him, well, at least on paper. Despite having been founded as a republic in 1923, Turkey has since suffered 4 coups at the hands of a military that had branded itself as the guardian of the country's democracy. There have been several failed takeover attempts as well. But especially after 2007, when the military published an online memorandum against the election of Abdullah Gül as president, the AK Party has tried to reduce its control on civilian governments. And following the failed 2016 coup, the party became determined to break the grip once and for all, and ensure that things wouldn't just remain in theory. Under the new system, the elected president is at the top of the structure. Beneath him is the Minister of the National Defense, who oversees the Army's top general, the Chief of Staff, as well as the commanders of land, naval, air and special forces below him. It's hoped that this new structure will overcome previous problems in the chain of command. This perhaps became most evident during the attempted coup of 2016, when Prime Minister Binali Yıldırım was unable to make direct orders to commanders not to obey the junta. Now the Turkish president can do that without having to go through their superiors. Former Chief of Staff Hulusi Akar, who the coup plotters took hostage on that July 15 night,
now becomes the first general in more than half a century to assume the role of a defense minister. Hasan Basri Yalçın is the director of the strategic studies at the Turkish think tank SETA, and he says the new structure will align Turkish democracy to international standards.
Turkey has solved a very important problem in its history. Right now we can expect that civil governments will define the general principles of how national security will be protected. Then professional soldiers, which are directly controlled by civil authorities, will do their own professional activities rather than dealing with the high politics issues of governments.
Many hope that this will not only mark a new beginning in Turkey, but also an end to its life in the shadows of the military. Can Asasu, Straight Talk.
And joining me now to discuss this further is Nilofer Narli. She's the head of sociology at Bahçeşehir University, and history professor Hakan Erdem from Sabancı University. Thank you so much for being here. Let's begin with you, Professor Narli. With these reforms, can we expect the end of military intervention in Turkish politics?
I think it is not wrong to hypothesize that this is the end of the military interventions, because when we look at the new model, new reforms and the new structure, we see a real paradigm shift in the civil-military relations. And in the past, the military had constitutional tools to have a type of control and oversight of the political decision making, but today civilian government has almost full-fledged control of the military affairs.
A full-fledged control?
It is, I mean, the control is really very extensive, and the critical question here is, yeah, this civilian control has been increased, and the civilian control reforms started with the EU harmonization reforms in 2002, but after the failed coup in 2016, new reforms were introduced.
This isn't happening in a vacuum, Professor Erdem. I want to bring you in as well. There's a long history. We're talking about the second largest army in NATO, in the NATO alliance. We're talking about an army that has gone through a lot of upheaval in the past couple of years. With the coup, a lot of its officers' corps is no more. Tell us about the Turkish military as an institution and the history of it, and these reforms in that context.
Officially, Turkish military counts the years from the Şuyunlu tribe of Central Asia, but it's, I mean, as with the case with most reforms, it has its roots in the Ottoman past and not so distant Ottoman past. I mean, in the second constitutional period after 1908, the Chief of General Staff was part of the Minister of War. In Ottoman times, it was Minister of War. Now we have Minister of Defense. There's a shift. So afterwards, during the early founding years of the Republic, the Chief of General Staff was a minister upon itself from 1920 to 1924. The funny thing is that the Minister of Defense was also in the cabinet. I mean, two commands parallel to each other in the army. So that changed in 1924, and the Chief of Staff became a kind of autocephalic institution until 1944, the year when the great Marshal Fevzi Çakmak died. After that, for a short while, for 5 years, it became answerable, responsible to Prime Minister's office, but in a rather, undefined way. In 1949, the Chief of General Staff became subsidiary to, answerable to, the Minister of Defense, exactly the way we are here today. I mean, for 10 years, 11 years, it continued like this.
From 49 to 1960.
1960, yes.
And then a coup happened. Turkey was living in the shadows or in the legacy of the military for much of this time, wasn't it?
That's true. And here I like to point out one thing. I wrote an article on the Turkish civil-military relations and what type of model best explains. And then I talk about concordance model. Concordance model is about a type of coalition amongst the military, political decision-making process and society. So what happened in Turkey, the guardianship model was accepted by the business elite, by the society, by the political elite. And this period ended after the EU harmonization reforms. And the European Union put a lot of pressure on Turkey to make changes in its civil-military relations because it wasn't democratic.
How does the appointment of that man, Hulusi Akar, then fulfill that? Continuation, he is no longer a military man. He's retired. He's part of a civilian democratic dispensation. How important is it?
If you are asking to me,
first
he can,
all right, well.
Very only one sentence. He can play an important role because he has a lot of experience and he witnessed the history, recent history of Turkey where civil-military relations went through alterations and difficult times. So he can be a really, I hope, a wise man and who can guide the new period because today also now we are in the presidential system, moved from parliamentary system to presidential system. And
you have a war in Syria.
Yes, so it's a very critical period.
Turkey is beyond its borders.
So it's an experienced person who knows the military bureaucracy, who knows the civilians is very critical.
Professor?
I liken him a bit to the founding marshal of Turkish Republic, that is Fevzi Çakmak. He was also controlling the army. On paper, his position was very different. He had a kind of autonomous, autocephalic institution under him. He was not answerable to Minister of Defense, but he was very subservient to the civilian authority represented by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk at the time. We know nothing in the way of his meddling with civilian affairs.
I guess I want to jump off that to a sociological question.
Yeah.
Is this fascination in Turkish society, this militarization of thought from very young age, with strong men in Turkish society? And how do we see the reforms in this context, if there is such a...
Yes, so when we look at, history, and of course Hakan Hoca is the historian, since from the Ottoman time, the military played a very central role. And there is a strong military culture. We have sayings like every Turk is a born soldier, and then every Turk is, ready for a war, and then Turkish man becomes a man after the military service. There are such sayings in Turkey. And the other thing, learning about military and then developing feelings for the country, for the military. In fact, it's almost
it's like a sacred,
combined. Yes,
it's like a sacred institute.
That's true, and it was in the formal school curriculum. And all these things were abolished after the EU harmonization reforms. And there are studies showing that respecting military is part of the political socialization in the formal curriculum. But today, it is not there anymore. But one thing, during the EU harmonization reforms and the Ergenekon-Balyoz trials, the military lost public trust. It is not a big loss, but there is a important decrease in the public trust.
And then you had the coup in which some public trust was lost as well, but there's always this thing. Moving on to...
may I just
add on, Professor, please
follow up. Actually, the Ottoman Empire, unlike our expectations, wasn't a militarized society until very late, until the Balkan Wars, until the First World War. Only after then the myth of military nation is born, And after the translation of the famous German Marshal von der Goltz's book into Turkish. Before that, that society wasn't that militarized. And the military did not meddle in civilian affairs. The Ottoman pashas were mostly civilian pashas. They are called pashas, but the Ottoman military was very, very, very politically loyal.
Apolitical.
apolitical and politically loyal, except for periods of coup d'etat. You know, and there are two, in 1876 and 1912. So there are, yes, except for that period, we don't have this military culture. I mean, the bottom line is that we don't have this military culture during the Ottoman times. This is a very, very Republican thing.
An interesting time. We are learning an uncharted territory, as the professor said. Professor Narli, Professor Erdem, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ali Mustafa. If you've got any comments or suggestions, do share them with us on Twitter, the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.